microphones are on. I'll do a brief welcome. Okay. Just let this person. That's okay. No hurry. So just come on in. Just have a seat wherever you'd like. Good evening, you all. I'm Marianne Brownlow. Welcome to Hill Center, and thank you so much for braving this extreme heat and coming out this evening. It really has been an unbearable, I think, about 2 weeks at this point. It's not often that we have the pleasure of welcoming two path-breaking, enthralling writers to Hill Center, and tonight is one of those singular nights where we have Ebony LaDelle and Elizabeth Acevedo, both of them quite extraordinary, electric writers. And let me see if I can juggle this. Ebony's newest book is Love Radio, and Elizabeth's is Family Lore. And our good friends and neighbors, East City Bookshop, are outside selling books. They've recently had some devastating flooding in the last few days, so, please support them. They'll be back open in a few days. Yeah, okay, shop online. And I'm going to turn it over to Ebony and to Elizabeth. Please welcome them.
Testing. Good evening. Can you hear me? Mic check. I got it. Hello. Okay, there we go. Hi, good evening, everyone. No, is it good? Okay, it's good. My name is Ebony LaDelle. I am the author of Love Radio, and I have the pleasure and honor of being here tonight to talk to one of my dear, dear friends, Elizabeth Acevedo. So I'm going to read Elizabeth's bio, and then she's going to bless us with an excerpt. Elizabeth Acevedo is the New York Times bestselling author of The Poet X, which won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, the Michael L. Printz Award, the Pura Bill Prey Award, the Carnegie Medal, the Boston Globe Horn Book Award, and the Walter Award. She is also the author of With the Fire on High, which was named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Public Library, NPR, Publishers Weekly, and School Library Journal, and Clap When You Land, which was a Boston Globe Horn Book Honor Book and a Kirkus finalist. She holds a BA in Performing Arts from the George Washington University and an MFA in Creative Writing from the University of Maryland. Acevedo has been a fellow of Cave Canem, Canto Mundo, and a participant of the Callaloo Writers Workshop. She is a National Poetry Slam champion and resides in Washington, D.C. with her loves. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Good evening. I am delighted to be here with you all for many reasons. One of those reasons is that Ebony and I are really good friends in real life, right? Not just on the writing circuit. Ebony and I met. She was my marketer for the Poet X. She worked at HarperCollins and was kind enough one day we were doing this event and I'm like, can I bring my mama? And she's like, yeah, you could bring your mom. I'm like, bring my mom to work day. So I brought her to the office, and Ebony has always held me in mind, I think, with a lot of love. And she actually came on tour with me for Family Lore. And so she has seen the ins and out of my publishing career in a way that really few people have. And we've never done a conversation like this. So I am delighted that in this very intimate setting where it seems like folks are here with their homegirls and hanging out with their friends, that two real life friends can kind of talk about writing and publishing and the journey. And so I'm excited. I think it's going to be really special for me, and hopefully you all will also enjoy how much I'm enjoying myself. I'm going to read an excerpt from Family Lore. Family lore is the story of 6 women, 4 of whom are elders. They are already in their 70s. 2 of whom are cousins. They're in their 30s. And it follows these women as they immigrate from the Dominican Republic to New York City. They all have their own challenges, and the story starts when one of the women, one of the elders, decides to throw herself a living wake, which is a little taboo for Dominican culture and maybe just in general. And so she invites her whole family, and nobody knows why she's doing this. And so the story takes place over the 3 days of executing this living wake, but also spans, decades and decades as they all consider what's happened in their lives that has brought them to this moment. This excerpt is from one of the younger women when she is 16. Yadira was in love with a neighborhood boy. They went to school together, and when they're both 16, he's incarcerated. And she's sent to the Dominican Republic, which is very common if you come from like certain immigrant Latin American backgrounds. Whenever something happens and they're like, we don't know what to do, it's not therapy. It's like, send them back to the homeland. And so this is not unusual, but Yadira's relationship with her grandmother is. Yadi's first week was spent waking up with the roosters and going to lie outside in the grass, watching the sunrise. Mama Silvia would watch from the window, calling out when the sun was high, ven pa dentro before you burn. But Yadi would let Mama's words mist over her. She'd stay lying there for hours, her nails scratching at the dirt like she was removing dandruff from her mother's scalp, listening to the song Put It On Me on her iPod shuffle, weeping, all the while attempting to ignore the back and forth flickering of the curtain. This kind of indulgent teen angst would have had her grandmother shooing at her with a broom to be useful and stop crying over a man, except Aunt was only a boy. And Yadi's heartbreak was so very palpable, as if it'd been tenderly folded, packed in her carry-on, and used to shroud her slight form from any hints of breeze. Something had died in her, and as was appropriate, the child was in deep mourning. Mama Silvia still demanded she be useful, but she didn't sigh too loudly when Yadi cried while doing dishes. Sometimes a girl must weep. As long as the oficios were done and the tears were mopped from the tiles, who was Mama to complain? In the relative isolation of El Campo, Yadi had thought she would feel in prison too. There was no computer in the house, no Ethernet cord. Depending on the time of day and the schedule of the powers that be, often there wasn't even reliable electricity. Her cell phone died for good in the middle of her playing a long-running game of Snake. That final connection to the before had puttered out, and she found it liberating, in fact. Even the bathroom was of the old school variety, the kind used in rural townships and por batalles, an outside toilet. It was clean, and at least it was an actual toilet instead of a latrine, but running water was shoddy in the country, and if the power grid was off, the ability to flush was off too. Despite all her children living in the United States and sending her money, Mama lived the way she had for the last 73 years. The first fight they had was about Yadi's business in that bathroom. She stood with her body blocking the rickety dink door. Mama, por favor, you don't have to go in there. I promise I'm fine. Muévete. Yadi shifted slightly, but didn't release the door handle. She just couldn't understand what words she needed to say in order to get Mama to leave her shit alone. It's fine. I promise I'm fine now, she tried. It started the second day after she'd arrived. Something hadn't settled well, and she'd spent the night in the outside bathroom. Mama, convinced Yadi's constitution was no longer resistant to parasites and tapeworms, had become hawk-eyed, following her outside every time she needed to piss or poop. Can I just describe it instead? A last-ditch attempt. Mama Silvia blinked at her, bewildered, as if trying to understand how a child of her blood could even consider offering not one, not two, but 3 whole comments in response to a direct command. Yadi moved, and Mama Silvia went inside with her stick to poke at her shit. She came out a moment later, throwing the stick into the grass, muttering under her breath, and Yadi knew that the entire day's menu and list of chores would now be navigated according to her morning excrement. Her shit, the North Star of their days. If her poop was leaky, Mama made her go to town to buy a cut of fresh meat and chicken bones from the butcher. There would be bone broth for dinner. If her poop was bile-colored, Mama made her shuck red beans for the evening meal. She added oregano to the girls' tea. Coal-colored, small, and hard was the worst verdict. That meant Yari would be spending the morning in the conuco, pulling up yuca, batata, and chayote. At midday, she'd need to grab the bucket and walk to the river to collect the yautía coquito that grew at the water's edge. It meant she'd be spending her afternoon in the kitchen, peeling, cutting, and stirring the sancocho made from all those ingredients that Mama insisted would provide the fiber, nutrients, artillery her gut needed. By August, Yari held the bathroom door open proudly, peering in with Mama to look at the toilet bowl. Muy bien, pero requete bien, mija, Mama said. Yari nodded. The brown poo was gorgeous, full of healthy stomach bile, the perfect balance of fiber and iron and magnesium, the sturdy stuff that kept it together. And more importantly, it'd been that way for weeks now. Whatever illness had been running through her system exorcised. This is how you heal, Niña. You are thoughtful about what you offer yourself. You study what you put out. In the end, Yari didn't stay through the summer. She stayed through the summer and her senior year. Yari told me this poop story years ago, and we didn't discuss it at that point because there was no going back. She'd made her decision on how she wanted to move forward. But I think we both wondered whether, in her own way, Mama Silvia had been trying to teach Yari something that wouldn't be examined in a classroom with a proctor, but would be tested again and again, poked at with a stick, perhaps trying to say, this is loving, this is loving, this is loving the shit you're willing to wade through. Thank you all for listening.
So I have to say, I have heard her read this so many times, and you would think at some point I'd be like, oh, here she go again. And I'm literally like getting teary-eyed again because I think that scene described so much of, like for me, it wasn't going to the DR, it was going to the country, right? So if you know, growing up for me, my mom sent me to the South. It was Mississippi for me. And I just think of my grandmother, and you think of the matriarchs, and you think of the women who have given you so much insight, and like how you have these metaphors. It's like, it's not about the poop, it's about you getting yourself together. And so I wanted to use this time because I have had the immense pleasure and honor of being with Elizabeth since the Poet X. I can't even say I saw you step into your power because you always had that power, but it was the world was finally able to see the power that you had. And it was so beautiful because I remember when I read the Poet X, it was a manuscript, and I was blown away. I knew. I was like, she has it because of all the themes, because this was a young adult book, but because I was able to see my parents in it, my siblings, my cousins, my this, my that, in a way that I felt like so many young adult books they weren't able to do, especially from a person of color. And also just showing nuance to young adult. You always read these books and it's like the kids are at school and that's it. And it's just like, what about the community that has supported them, that has helped them, that has shaped them? So it's great to be able to talk to you tonight because I want to talk about the through lines through all your book,
sure.
all your books. I think like obviously matriarchs, intergenerational, like family dynamics are super important to you. And so this excerpt had me thinking a lot about just the self-care. Yeah. When we think of Yadi's poop story, or we think of, I'm trying to think of some other stories that were, like Zirmara finding her voice, or we think of Imani being a confident chef. And these are characters within her books. They're all trying to find their voice and their power and choosing themselves, right, in all of this, right? Mm-hmm. And so I even think about Matilda's quote in Family Lore when she says, I may not know much about living my own life, but I'm smart for others. And how aren't we all victims of that? You can't take the advice that you give. And so what I wanted to know for you is like, we're all trying to find ways to love on ourselves, to practice that self-care, this word that is used so much. But how do you actually practice it? Like, especially as women, when you go through these different moments throughout your life, you're having to learn and relearn how to, like, love yourself. So, like, incorporating that into your story and trying to practice, you know, what you preach. Like, how does Elizabeth practice her self-care?
I think Family Lore was a book where I was really meditating on what love as a practice is, and what it is to love well and live well and prepare to die well, right? To live as if you are preparing to die well. I want to live a life that I can leave knowing I spent it. I spent the time doing things that filled me up and that hopefully filled the cups of others, right? And you have to imagine it's 2020, it's the middle of the pandemic, and so a lot of people are talking about self-care. We're all in social isolation. We're trying to figure out how to stay connected to each other. My entire family is in New York. It's me and my husband in Southwest DC, taking long walks by the tidal basin every day, right? That was our like outing. And I think a lot of things became simple, but it really is about practice. And so there are things I know I should be doing that really help, but the practice of doing them is where I find I need the discipline and just ability to show up. But long walks, right? There's something about the forward motion, about very simple movement, and going outside and getting sunshine and being by water, and like just trying to take in, especially if you do the same route every day, how present can you be on that route? How aware can you be to see something new, right? I've been to the tidal basin so many times, but after it rained, there would be fish that would be near the surface. And I'm like, that's a big old fish, right? Or the tidal basin floods, and so you have to figure out a new route. Or there were certain birds that, depending on the season, we all became birders during the pandemic, right? All of a sudden, I'm like, that's a cardinal, that's a titmouse, right? Like, we know things. But like those little practices of, I am alive today, I am taking notice. I am taking notice. Gratitude, right? I have a gratitude journal that I write intermittently in, but when I do, I feel so great. And so I think really showing up and just every day working on being grateful, like what an incredible charmed life I get to live every day, even on the days that feel really difficult, just trying to find that positive. Taking care of my gut. I mean, you know about all my irritable bowel syndrome, so you know that this passage is very near and dear to my heart, but it's so true. Like, how many of us are lactose intolerant? We're like, I'm gonna get a slice of pizza. And it's like, how do you take care of your gut? How do you take care of yourself? Because, it's all connected. And my brain and my anxiety is so connected to what I'm eating and how I nourish myself. And I think I'm in definitely in an age now, moving towards an age where the self-indulgence of, I think, my 20s and my early 30s of, well, I'll just drink what I want to drink and eat what I want to eat. And that's like tomorrow's problem. Yeah. Like that, all of a sudden, I'm like, oh no, no, girl, I don't want to do that tomorrow. I know that problem tomorrow is going to hurt. Like, I don't want to do that. And so I think hearing that voice and being like, yeah, no, I'm going to listen. Like, I'm done. And I didn't have that kind of ability to say, no, that's not good for tomorrow me.
So in thinking about self-care for the characters, I feel like their gifts are sort of the thing that brings them life and brings them the self-care. Can you talk a little bit about each of the characters' gifts in the stories to give the audience an idea?
I love magical realism, and I wanted to kind of think about the magical realism that we've all think of when we think of specifically Latin American magical realism, right? So House of Fortunes, everything by Garcia Marquez, right? Like this really grand, and I wanted to make it urban, and I wanted to make it a little more hood, and I wanted to make it a little bit more young. And so one of the women, the one who decides to throw herself a living wake, Flor, can see when people are going to die in her dreams. And so her whole life she knows when someone is about to pass, which is why this is such a huge moment that she's throwing a wake, because what does this mean? Pastora, who is her younger sister, can tell when you're lying. She can feel when someone is lying to her, and so she kind of has this internal barometer of like bullshit, right? And she's just like, I'm calling it. And then the younger generation has some funky stuff. And so Yadira, who you heard about here, when her grandmother passes, inherited a taste for limes. So she hates citrus fruits until her grandmother dies. And then all of a sudden she craves lime all the time, which is like a really quirky kind of magic. Has none of these skills have any benefits to anyone. They can't capitalize off of it. They don't get a job with it. It's just a part of who they are and the fabric. Ona has an alpha vagina. which I think is pretty self-explanatory, right? Like her nanny does the thing and she is very proud. I think there's a way I was trying to think of sexuality and being raised really with a lot of repression around pleasure and around our bodies, and you don't say certain things and you always have your legs crossed, but you don't cross your legs in church, right? Like all the little things you have to learn, and what it means to come from a culture that has a lot of sensual dancing, but you're not allowed to express that you enjoy that, right? Like there was just so much confusion growing up around my body, and so this idea of a character that has a vagina that is magical felt like I could really challenge some things that I was raised with, and what does it mean for her to own that? And what does it mean for her family to know that that's her magic, right? And I kind of have to contend with like, okay, girl, right? Who am I missing? Oh, and then Matilde, who doesn't have any magic that they know of, but claims magic, claims her own thing. Through dancing, that she has made her special powers.
And even talking about the dancing, like what's too much, what's enough, Matilda's story is very much that, right? Yeah. Whereas she obviously lights up a room every time she's on the dance floor, but she has people in her life who try to dim her light. Yeah,
that's not real. Yeah, that's not real magic, or you're not really as special as your siblings. I forgot to mention Camila, and she's forgotten often in the story and in the lives of the women, but she's the baby, and she can use herbs. She's an herbalist.
So I want to get into some of like your writing style. I'm going to do something that an amazing writer that you all may know, Imani Perry, did on Elizabeth's tour, where she read some of her quotes. So as I'm asking you questions, I'm just going to read a couple things like through your books, just so you know, so that everybody can get a sense of your writing. There are two that I'm going to read. I think you should write about the one that scares you the most. Taking risk and making choices in spite of fear. It's what makes our life story compelling. And that's from With the Fire on High. And this is the one I'm going to ask you about. It almost feels like the more I bruise the page, the quicker something inside me heals. So my question to you is, as a writer, as a poet, when did you have this moment? When did you have this moment where, as you were bruising the page, you quickly felt like you were healing yourself? Because one of the things that me and Elizabeth, I found out after you said it, and I was like, oh, I feel so seen, was that Elizabeth has journals that she's kept since she was little. And my dad is here too, he can speak to this. I also have a ton of journals that I used to keep. And so it's been so fascinating as an adult to read them, and even at different points in your life as an adult to read them. So for you, when did you realize, like, oh, as I'm like writing this stuff out, like I'm healing myself?
I don't know how aware I was about what the process was doing. I didn't journal in diary entries. I journaled through poems. So I would write a poem every day, and it was written in lines, and I would make sure to have rhyme or metaphors or whatever I was working on. Huh?
How old were you?
I started journaling when I was 8.
Okay.
And really became around 13. It was like a daily practice, right? And up until, I mean, even into college, like that was my thing. So I would be trying to think of my day or what might have happened or what came up for me, and trying to form like where's the art, right? And I didn't know that there was a way that I was seeking catharsis, that I was trying to release some of the big emotions that I had, especially when you're thinking about puberty and like 13, not always being able to talk at home about what I was feeling, that where I wrote my poems, which I think I wrote in poetry because I didn't want, if someone read it, for them to know what I was actually getting at. I could hide behind the metaphor, I could hide behind the imagery. So if my mom picked it up, I'm like, first there's English, that's a barrier, but also there's figurative language. And so I could be like, that's not what I meant. Like, it's a metaphor, right? Like I had all these defenses already set. But I wonder at how much someone who at times felt very lonely the page was really offering me somewhere to go and put those feelings, right? And the daily practice of doing that. And now that I know of, like, you know, my therapist has me journaling. Like, it's just such a big part of, like, how you can release things. You can put language to your experiences, right? Which makes you know this really happened. And what I felt was real. And I can let it go, and the page can hold it now, or I can come back until I'm ready to let it go, right? That there was something about removing what haunted me and tucking it away and closing that I think was really helpful, given how big some of the feelings I had were. But I don't know that I knew. I don't know that I named it as like, this is a practice I am doing because it helps me arrive at healing. You know, when writing the Poet X and I'm rereading my journals because I'm trying to kind of calibrate the character I'm writing, who is a poet, and like, where's my language matching? Is that how I would have written when I was her age? Where do I need to push it? Where do I need to go? I'm rereading and I'm like, look at all these feelings and things I was trying to process, and this was where I would go. There was no counselor, there was no mom. I didn't necessarily talk to my best friend all the time about in depth, but like, there were always notebooks.
And sometimes you don't even know what you're trying to say when you're talking to someone. You just need to let the emotions out on the page, and you look back on it and you're like, oh, I'm able to fully understand what I was going through.
Yes. I will say that is something I knew early on.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I don't know what I'm trying to write until I'm done.
Yeah.
And then I would finish a poem and be like, that's how I felt, for real?
Exactly.
Like, I didn't know that was how I felt. You know, it was like this belief that the poem knew more than me, but it was me working through it.
You trust in yourself. I mean, that's what they say about the page. You have to be truthful. So it's like, not knowing what you're writing, like it's so strange. You almost like go into a zone, and when you like come to, you're like, oh, these are all the things, these are all the emotions. That
and the poem is smarter.
Yeah,
the writing is smarter, right?
Yeah.
It does have more than we can kind of communicate this way. We think through writing. It is a kind of thinking. Yeah.
So I think in terms of your writing and the journals, one of the things that I'm always fascinated with you is like the way in which you, like, everything to me that you write is poetry, right? It could be a post, it could be a social post, it could be your writing. How do you decide what are the things that you feel are compelling enough to like keep to to actually put on the page to show to the world? How do you decide what things you choose to keep to yourself? Like, what is that process of editing, I guess, your work for your own personal like sanity, honestly?
Yeah. It's changing quite a bit.
Okay.
This book, I think, there were a lot of parts that were compelling that I realized would have been okay if I kept. They didn't need to be for the world, right? Because sometimes things are compelling and sometimes they're titillating, and those are not the same. And I think there are things I wrote that will titillate audiences that don't know me, but there's not that kind of compassion and grace, right? And then so I put it into the world, and then I was like, oh no, I want to take that part I'm too exposed by. So I think I now know that distinction in a way I didn't before I wrote this book. But you know, if I'm writing and it's just like, this really is just catharsis. Like there's either the idea is not of value because it's been written about or I've written about it, or the language is not arriving with precision, then that's not something that I need to put into the world. I think what goes into the world to be read has to push beyond what we already know. If it could be a Twitter caption that we've already seen, there's no reason it needs to be in my book. I can just retweet it and keep it moving, right? Like for me, there's something about newness.
Yeah.
Has this been said? Has it been said in this way? And if it doesn't check that off, then it doesn't need to be read by anyone but me. Then that's more an exercise than it is something that should be published.
Yeah.
What's your criteria for what you publish versus what you keep to yourself?
I mean, honestly, I just let it go. Like I put it all out there, and then as I'm reading it, it really is like, oh no, I don't want, I don't want, like you said, I don't want to be that exposed. But even with those words, like I'll put it aside, I'll put it in another document, I'll read it for myself later. I might actually feel brave enough later on to be like, you know what, I want to put that in the book, but I'm gonna condense it a bit. Like maybe not this whole paragraph, but maybe it's a conversation, or maybe I don't like the way it's structured in this way, so I'll shift it. But yeah, really big. I'm just being a private person by nature. It's like how can I preserve the things that are like super important to me, but also be vulnerable on another page that people see themselves in it too.
Right.
Yeah. So I have so many questions, but I'm going to. Okay, we're gonna move on because I want to make sure we get through all these questions. And this is one. This is what I love about your writing the most, like the boldness and the fearlessness of these females that you write within your stories. One of the quotes that I love that you had in Family Lore is, "I love you in every form of woman you become and unbecome." And so much of womanhood is just sort of finding yourself and refining yourself and refining yourself. And also what I love about your stories is even the women who are sort of the antagonists, they also get sort of a redemption arc, or they get sort of chastised in love, I would say is the best way to describe it. But so much of your work is about empowerment. And so my question for you is, and then the last quote that I wanted to mention that I really, really love is, "Bueno, the best way to learn to swim is to jump into a body of water that wants to kill you." And so I chose this quote because, it embodies so much bravery in a woman. Like, we are constantly being told what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to do it, how we're supposed to walk into the world. And in spite of that, we have to be the ones to jump, right? Like, we have to do the thing that feels impossible. And I think the beauty of you writing, being able to write into adult is you're able to sort of talk about this, not just from a teenager's perspective, but to be able to have someone look back over their life as well and talk about it in that way. And so can you talk about some of the characters you've written throughout your career, and how you're thinking about bravery as you're writing them? I know you just kind of write. So are you thinking at the end of this story, I want them to find their power in this, or does the bravery sort of show up in the story?
I always want to leave my characters having arrived at an understanding of themselves they did not have at the start of the book, right? So some type of self-awareness or knowledge of self. The main characters, right? Your antagonist might not always be self-aware, but your main character through the journey is able to arrive at, now I am this kind of person. Now I am this kind of woman because of what I had to go through. I think inherently to look at yourself and move forward, it requires bravery. It's very easy to lie to ourselves. It's very easy to stay in comfortable situations because it's what we know. And deciding to remove comfort and push, I think is really brave. Right? My mother was the first woman in our family to come to this country. She's one of 15. And she was the elected child because the other ones were too old and married. And so it's a lot harder to get a visa if you're already married. And the other ones were too young. And so she left her entire family to kind of spearhead this movement. They are now all here, right? So she brought all my 64 first cousins and my aunts and uncles and her parents, right? And so when I think about a 26-year-old launching herself into a world where she didn't speak the language, didn't understand the customs, to the point where she wrote this letter to her mom. She's like, "The trees here don't have leaves." And it's because she moved here in winter, right? and the Dominican Republic always has leaves, right? So she's just like, this is such a strange place. What is happening, right? This idea of seasons, the bravery to show up and say, this is what is best for my family. I think there are small moments where we are brave that never get lauded, right? It's not the big movement of, I became vice president of whatever. It's not the breaking the glass ceiling, but it's small enough that it changes the trajectory of your life. And I could always, my mom and I have had, I write a lot about mothers and daughters because I think there's a way that we have both really wanted to be close to each other and cannot be friends. And we just don't know how to do it. And so it's hard to really love someone and also be like, I don't think you know me. And I don't know if you want to know me or if you want to know a version of me. And I think even that conversation takes bravery. To say, Ma, I want to be closer to you, and also this is what I require of my friends. And so if you want to be my friend, there's something I'm going to need from you. Or we could maintain this relationship as it is, and that's okay too, right? But we won't be friends. right? And so even the conversations we're having now as I'm getting older, she's getting older, of wanting to move towards closeness, but it requires us both to leave notions of each other behind. It requires us to be really brave and say, I'm going to try again. Even though you always hurt me when I do this, I'm going to try again. That I think it's those little things, and it's those observations I'm most interested in when I'm talking about bravery. How do you tell the truth? How do you be really honest even when there's potential hurt there? And so my characters are, you know, it's not ever, I think, these massive arcs, but it's these little moments of, I'm going to leave what I have known behind and try to take one step into the unknown in the hopes that it'll reward me. Yeah.
So speaking of mothers and daughters, because that is another major theme, I want to read these two quotes, especially this first one after what you said. How could I explain? I left young because I had to, because this woman who wanted to protect me so much had let her care braid itself into a vice around my throat. I could not be a woman in her home. And then the second one is, I like to think there was a time before our mothers and theirs and theirs and theirs, some great who knew her own pleasure, a time before we were wrapped in corsets and courtships and the approximation of proper. I like to think we were nations of women who were undulated to a music all our own. And so these are two quotes from Family Lore, and I love them so much because I think, one, the second quote in particular, it makes me think of, like, you know, those intergenerational relationships. There's almost survival skill, at least I feel, with having women before you who have experienced so much, who went through so much, just so that, you know, me and you could be sitting right here, right? And feeling, you know, a bit guilty in the sense of, like, they weren't able to do the things that we weren't able, that we're able to do. You also sometimes can feel that in the dynamics between mothers and daughters. But you also understand that so much of their care and, like, this, like, smothering is because of their own fears and because they put so much into you. And so... It's like,
I'm laughing because Ebony knows I became a mom 20 months ago, and I don't know who I was talking to this morning. I'm like, he's not going away to school. Like, he's staying in my house, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is my big thing with my mom. She didn't want me to go away to college. I'm like, we got colleges in DC. He don't got to go. Right?
And so this is what I actually want to talk to you about, because, you know, you're writing this story, you know, as a mother. And obviously you were a very new mother, so the experiences that you have with your mother are completely different. But did that change a bit of how you wrote, while you were writing Family Lore, did that change how you were writing the stories of the women in the family?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think if I'm not using writing as a way to practice empathy, I'm doing it wrong. And this book in particular, because I was writing the mother characters and the daughter, I had to give the mother characters their own world of, this is why I do the thing I do, right? I mean, the moment where I felt like I had arrived at a really interesting dynamic was Yadira, who you all heard from, is a vegan. And she describes this moment early on in the book where she found her mother chewing on a chicken bone that she had left on her plate. So she leaves the plate, leaves it in the kitchen, and the mom is eating the chicken bone, right? And she's like, I was just so disgusted by this, like, need for meat that, like, I became a vegan. Then you hear the mom's side of the story. The mom is like, the meat always went to my father and brothers. We only had the rice and the plantains, and I always craved meat. And how dare this girl leave even a little bit of meat on a bone? She doesn't really appreciate what it takes, right, to have a full meal. Look at her, right? And so it's like, for me, that having to go back and forth on, like, how do I write moments where, depending on the character, you fully see why they are righteous or they're angry, but then, oh, this is why a mom would do this. This is why a mom would want to hold you close. This is the kind of thing she went through that she's trying to protect you from, right? Like, and I get it, at least with the women in my family and my best friend's family and the women I've been really close to, that smothering is a way of trying to protect. Yeah. It's a way of trying to guard against, right? If I can hold you tightly, the world can't hurt you. And they don't realize, like, holding me tightly hurts, right? Like, that's also painful. Yeah. And so it's how do I show empathy to that and massage that idea while holding that both of those truths have validity, right? But because they can't talk about it, because she can't be like, yo, Ma, I really didn't like that you ate my leftovers. And she can't say, well, I hate that you waste even
Yeah.
a little bit, right? Like they don't arrive at that. And so I think for me, there's so much at play on like on empathy that I'll write passages and be like, oh, I gotta call my mom and apologize, right? Because I wrote a
Yeah.
character that is not my mother, but
Exactly.
that opens me up to the possibilities of why she may have done something
Yeah.
and how she does not have the language to tell me what it was,
Yeah.
or the thought that I would even care, so she doesn't volunteer it.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question, and I'm going to open it up. The question that I have for you is, now that Family Lore has been out for a year, there's a paperback, there's the Spanish edition, you are able to have so many more conversations with readers than you probably had before, and so many different like ages of readers. And so you have, you know, your day ones who probably are adults now, giving their moms and their grandmothers copies of the books. What has been some of the conversations, sort of like and I remember when we were talking about this last year, I was like the intergenerational book club. Like, what have been some of the conversations from readers, either like while you've been, you know, at an event or afterwards, that they've come up to you and told you about that like really struck a chord with you?
I always find this question so hard. I'm very self-deprecating, and often I get compliments or things, and I like can't even hear it.
This is true.
Ebony and my husband are always like, did you hear that? Did you pause? Right? But like I can't receive it, right? So it's something that I'm working on. I think the biggest compliment that really hits home every time is when someone tells me, either a mother tells me she bought a book and read it and then bought it for her daughter so that they could read it, especially if it's like a teen, like the subjects in this book I wanted to talk about with her.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to have this. Or when it's a daughter who like buys Family Lore and is like, I bought it in Spanish for my mom because I want to discuss it. Something about that very intimate two-person book club. I met a woman recently who buys her nieces all of my books, and now her niece is old enough for this one, and she's like, we're doing a book club to discuss it. That for me, the book becomes useful. It is now a tool for us to have a conversation. It is.
Giving people a language.
It gives people a language. Like this moment where this happened, you know, it really made me think of this time that, and I just remember being young and like being such a voracious reader and really wanting my parents to read what I read, like to be able to talk to them about the books and be like, maybe if I could tell them like how this character, that's why like
Yeah.
maybe I could use it.
Yeah.
And so for me, there's nothing that hits quite like that. Like friends who don't live in the same city, but they have the same book, and it's a way of connecting that feels, this connection between writer and reader feels huge, right? You get insight into my mind, but that connection feels like, oh, there's a bridge there that may not have been there if not for these words.
Yeah.
And I just know the books that have done that for me, that have opened up my ability to connect with people. And I cherish that. So that's for me the one that like blows me away anytime I hear it.
That's a good one.
Yeah,
That's
thank
a
you.
good
I
one.
tried.
I appreciate that one. Okay, so we're going to open up to questions.
Let me give you the microphone if you have a question, just because we're live streaming this. Any questions?
Thank you to Janet. Our poetry share group yesterday discussed at length your poem about your hair.
Thank you, Janet.
And so in the context of what you've just been talking about with your mother, I was struck by the fact that at the beginning of the poem you referred to her as my mother. And then at the end, because it's a full circle, you refer to her as Mama. And I wondered if that was conscious, because I found that very interesting as I reread the poem, and whether or not if your mother read the poem, she was struck by that as well.
I'm struck by that. I didn't realize I had done that. And so, right, like, again, the poet mind, that there's a way that that's very intimate, right? It's the first word. It's the, like, I'm calling to a part of you that is not the mother. I'm calling to the part of you that is my mama, right? Like, there's something.
Well, at the beginning, it's like you're a grown woman, and why is my mother
Yeah.
talking about my hair? And so you're talking about her in a more formal way of,
Yeah.
my mother.
Yeah,
And then as the poem unfolds,
yeah. You're reduced to the.
I think you're reverting to
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good read. That's a better read than I think.
But I think if you were subconsciously, as you said, you're
Yeah.
struggling with your characters, to
Yeah.
Anyway,
No, I mean, I'm thinking of that poem, and that poem has changed for me a lot. I mean, I wrote that poem, I was 19. I was very angry. I was very angry that this man that I loved, you know, could possibly, because of his race, bring up any type of questions. I just thought we were beyond that, and I couldn't and the poem tries to contextualize, like, because you come from a place that has been colonized, you have these ideas about race. But 20 years later, right, like that poem, you change in how you can offer grace, and how in my relationship to her, to my now husband, right? There's a lot there. And so I rewrote that poem and published it as an illustrated book 3 years ago now. And the language changes. It's not directed at my mom anymore, right? That there was a way that I wanted the text to allow for her growth, right? And look differently at who the they is that tells us to fix our hair and what it means to fix things. And so I think one of the hardest things as a writer is to put something into the world and it seems fixed, and you grow and you evolve and you're like, oh no, if I could pull it back and edit it, right? And that's a poem that I've had to sit with. My mom did not know about that poem until all my cousins moved here, right? And then she heard about it and they translated it for her. And she was not a fan of that poem. And is still not really a fan of that poem because she feels like, you know, I don't do justice to her tenderness and her love, but I think it's a pretty good poem. I mean, it did a lot of good work, so.
And that's what I love about poetry, because now I'm going to read it tonight when I go back home. But, you know, obviously hair, like just the first time I read that poem, I'm like, oh my God, finally someone is speaking the exact words that I've been like feeling my entire life. But just hearing your frame, like I couldn't get to that point of the poem, seeing how she sort of became like, you know, a child in her, like, mom, like, I want you to see me, because I'm so focused on like I feel. And so it kind of feels the same way when we were. I'm like you. I'm 19-year-old Elizabeth too. Like, I'm tired of this, you know? That's a beautiful way to
That's
interpret
beautiful.
it.
I mean, I think there's something to be said about the way we write, and we don't realize the registers we're tapping into that are doing that work. I love that, right? It, you know, it's a part of me that's like, oh, I'm smarter than I think, right? It makes me a little bit more confident. Yeah, and now I'm a mama. And that poem kind of ends looking at my future child, right? So thanks for bringing that up. Thank you.
Did you have a question? Yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I had a question in terms of because of your writing is such personal, relationship-based, oftentimes, particularly in your poems. I was really curious about your relationship with travel and how traveling has impacted either writing a particular piece or like writing in general, like those experiencing your relationship with the places you visited, or whether places or things that have impacted you in such a way that kind of reshaped the way you look toward writing.
I love this question. I remember hearing when June Jordan first moved out to California, the ways in which her cadence changed, right? Coming from the East Coast, and she wrote in a particular way, and then her lines got longer and slower. And it was such a moment where I realized that my work does that. Depending on where I travel, I'm a borrower of language, so I hear something, I'm like, oh, I like that word, oh, I like that phrasing, oh, I like the syntax there that was used. What happens if I take Spanish and put it there? What happens if I take these words? And so for me, there's something about writing is just about the eye, right? It's literally just like, what do we look at? How can I look at the same thing you look at, but see an image or find a story in that? And so I think when we travel, our eye is feasting. It's like everything we haven't seen, it's finding beauty, it's finding art, it's making connections that we can't always make when we're in the same place, because this becomes rote, right? And so I find that, I think it's why people like retreats, because you go away, right? But how much of it is that you're isolated, and how much of it is that you're also just giving your eye something new, a new palette, right, to work with. I remember being a child and going to DR, and I would be filling up my notebooks. And I was like, oh, I'm just inspired by this country, right? But I think it was just the difference, and wanting to match the cadence, and wanting to write about that sea, right? And that food, and like, you know, in a way that the proximity I had in New York was just, I was writing about something else. So I find that when we move, when we go places, I think it has a profound impact on the musicality, on the toolbox of images, and on where we find beauty. I think we're practicing in that moment. Is there a poem here? Is there a poem here? Is there a poem here? In a way that we forget, I think, when we're home.
You mentioned June Jordan. What other writers have influenced you? What writers do you like?
Yeah, I mean, my OG is Lucille Clifton. I think she is, since I was a teen, I just find her work so vivid. I love that she uses such short poems to get across so much. So Lucille, for me, is like the godmother of all my work. I love Toni Morrison, Angie Cruz. In the YA space, Meg Medina, who is the current ambassador for children's literature, was, I remember reading her teen work and just, I don't know anyone who has a better ear. Her dialogue is so crisp, and to write for children in a way that they hear and they're like, this isn't, you know, it's not someone who's 4 decades older than me. She has that ear. That's so special. And so I want to have Meg Medina's ear. I'm trying to think. Kiese Leman, I just think is I don't write nonfiction, but if I did, I would want to write like him. Disha Filia, her book, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, I think of as a mentor text for this book. It's a short story collection. I highly recommend it. It's hilarious and heartbreaking and just beautiful. I mean, I could go on and on. Ebony, LaDelle, right? Love Radio is wonderful. There's so many, but a handful.
One last question. Wait.
I
do
think
we
we
have two?
could do two.
Yeah, I was like,
green
did you-
shirt and then orange shorts.
First of all, I just want to say thank you. I am a super fan, so I am just delighted to be here. I want to thank the Hill Center for hosting you and giving us this amazing opportunity to have with the both of you. And thank you for being such a great interviewer, because you guys have such a great work. Yeah,
I agree.
love your questions. Love your questions.
I always have to pretend, like, whether or not the person is great, I have to be like, that was great. But, like, Ebony came through and I knew I was safe. I was like, I'm going to be cared for tonight. And I was.
Well, I always feel cared for when I read your story, so it makes it easy. And the questions continue.
Agreed. So I just want to kind of follow up on his question about travel. I love the way you capture and write about food in your books. Like, I'm like, okay, what is that recipe? And it's in such a way that you can visualize it, you can smell it. It touches all the senses. So I want to just hear more about how you incorporate, like how you decide to incorporate that. And then I also have a question about how you create your characters too.
I think that food is probably one of the simplest art forms that a lot of our mothers had at their disposal, that was considered a utility for the family, but was a way to express themselves, right? And I mean, at least for my mom, who enjoyed cooking. If you didn't enjoy cooking, then it probably isn't art. But my mom really would like make things happen and then like add her own thing to it, right? So like her chicken parmesan probably doesn't look like an Italian restaurant, but she just would use certain ingredients and mix this with that and like something she saw. And I just always found it so artful, her approach to it. And so for me, food as a way to connect and to go back to roots and to find your way home, right? And to bring people to your home, but then to also flip it. Like, I think that innovation of it's not just great-great-grandmother's recipe, but it's also here we have these ingredients, and so we have to use that. I remember a couple years ago, my mom was introduced to turmeric, right? And all of a sudden, it was ending up in the sancocho, it was in the pastelito, it was in the rice. And I'm like, Mommy, I do not want turmeric on the salmon. Like, when I have the salmon, I don't want it. She's like, yeah. I'm eating it. I'm like, Ma, it was just a little bit, right? But it's like, what can I do with this ingredient? How else can I, you know? And so that kind of, I've felt that before. I think those of us who are writers feel that where we read something and we're like, ooh, like, what does the prose block do? Let me go play with that, right? You're playing. There's joy in that. And so a lot of my characters, I think, are trying to connect through food, and they're trying to go back to their roots and their heritage, but they're also thinking about, but I'm here in this moment, and how can I remix? Right? How does my point of view come out through these recipes? And so I imagine I'll be writing about chefs for a while. There's a food truck in my next book. Like, I mean, at this point, that'll be my third book with someone who's interested in food. But I think it's pivotal. It's pivotal for our communities to, like, slow, thoughtful food practices that gather us. And I think honoring that in the books feels right.
Thank you.
And you said you had a quick follow-up?
Well, my second question was about the creation of your characters. Like, how do you come up with your characters? Because even though they're different, they have common themes. And so, like, and they're not your typical characters. In a lot of ways, they're just everyday people. And, you know, they have these journeys throughout the story that, in some cases, some people have never met this type of character, but in some cases, it's somebody who's your best friend, right? Like, I know someone that happened to, right?
Yeah.
So just wondering how you come up with your characters.
I think exactly what you just said.
Okay.
Just finding the hero in the everyday person. I think I look for the blanks. Who haven't I seen in the American literary canon?
Exactly.
I have not seen a teen mom who wanted to be a chef, who had been told your life is over because you had a child, but still trying to figure it out. I haven't seen an anthropology professor who's doing an oral history of her family, and her mother knows when people are going to die. Like, who haven't I seen, but who I know, right? Who I kind of grew up with, or I have a sense of who they are, or like I taught at some point, or I was taught by, right? And so I just look for my community, and where aren't they? And do I have the craft and skill set to write them? And then I attempt to do that.
I love that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think one final question here.
Okay, pressure's on. So you're a very versatile writer. And one thing I'm interested in is, how has the writing experience or process been different across different genres and forms that you've written? And what's one thing, or maybe whatever it is, it could be multiple things, that's constant about your process or your experience as a writer?
The doubt is constant, right? It doesn't matter what award I get, what achievement. It doesn't matter what kind of external validity comes. It's like cute for 2 days, and then I'm like, they're going to know I'm a fake, right? They're going to know I'm a terrible writer. And so I've had to figure out ways to just, regardless of what I'm writing, there's always a part of me that is, my brain wants to outpace my skill all of the time. And so it's just like, when you're in the process of always getting better, hopefully, right, you're judging yourself against the self you imagine you'll be, and that's just so hard. Like, I am right now as fast as I'm gonna be, and I will be faster tomorrow, but right now I'm here, and I have to appreciate here. And so I really struggle with appreciating the writer I am, and just trusting that she's gonna do good work. So that's pretty constant. I think the biggest distinction for me would be between prose and verse, because I do have there's what I perform, there's my poetry that's for journals, like I have a lot of modes, but I trust verse, I trust poetry, I trust that a poem arrives, I trust that a poem is patient, I trust that I can work on a poem now and let it sit, and in a month come back and it'll have a new door for me. I don't know if prose is as patient. I think prose is needs time, right? Like, it's a high maintenance, partner. And so I find that if I write and then I come back a month later, it's clunky, I'm clunky. I'm like, oh, we don't know how to dance. Like, we got to get in shape again. And so that's the biggest difference, that the poems I come back to and I can fall into them. But with prose, I need long stretches or long hours, and maybe I can put it away, but I'll have to start at the top, reread the whole thing, kind of get it in my bones again, and then I write. And so it's arduous in a way that poetry just doesn't have that same need of me to be present all of the time. It like lets me live, and then it's like when you're ready, you know, put all that living into the poem. And so that's probably been a big one that I've noticed, that depending on what I'm writing, they just they have a different level of tolerance for my, you know, escapism, my like being in the world. Great question.
Thank you.
Can I let Lori Gilman, the owner of East City Bookshop, ask the final question?
Thank you for giving me another minute. But I was just sitting here thinking about, I was really struck by your saying that you were thinking about, after writing Family Lore, things that were titillating versus compelling. And looking back at that and feeling like, oh, wait, that wasn't exactly the thing that I wanted to do from this vantage point, if that's what you were saying. And is that something that's come up through your writing process, or was it because this was a fiction, prose for adults? And is it something, looking back, if you can remember if it came up, like, did an editor talk with you about any of those things that you thought, oh, okay, since this was I guess a newish experience writing fiction for adults, fiction prose for adults, if there were things that you're now looking back on as sort of, okay, I'm going to keep that.
I mean, I think I learn from every book, and even with the Poet X, I do the audiobooks for all of my books. And so I remember doing the audiobook for the Poet X and being like, oh no, like I want to rewrite the whole thing, right? So I always feel that. I think Family Lore has a lot of sex, which my YA clearly doesn't. And I was raised very prudish. And so there are parts of me that feel like there was a lot of ways it came up, and I'm just wondering at how things were handled and discussed. And because there's 6 point of views, I borrowed a lot from my mom's stories and my aunts, not necessarily from interviews, and I let people know I was writing about them, but my memory is long, right? And there are things I remember people saying when I was 7 or 8 or 9. So even if I tell them, yeah, I'm gonna write about this time that we talked, and it's not the same as my thinking now. Like, was it fair to write this dialogue that I had heard? Was it fair to extrapolate an idea of a marriage that I kind of known from a distance into a marriage I wrote about? And I think that there are moments where I'm like, no, that's fair. Like, that was fiction, you did art, you did the thing. And I think there are moments where I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if that was loving, to have a book in the world that says this thing that maybe my mom or my aunt or my best friend's mom doesn't know she once said, or would feel shamed if she knew that those were her words at one point. And so I think that's where I'm kind of thinking through, and I don't know that I've had that same experience with the other books, because those characters are just very different. And writing for children is different. I remember writing the Poet X and being really worried about my mom reading that book and like thinking the mom was about, and she's like, this crazy lady's not about me. Like, that's not me at all. And I'm like, okay, right? And so there's also ways that I think the characters are really naked and you can see my whole everything. And then people don't even see any of it. So it's like, I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but there's a way I want to continue working on being loving in my writing towards the people that I love, even if they inspire me to just, that if they read the books, they too feel held.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. And give it up one more time for the Elizabeth Acevedo. Appreciate you.
And for Ebony LaDelle, please. And both Ebony and Elizabeth will be signing their books this way, out this door. And again, they're for sale. Thank you both so much. This is really extraordinary conversation.